Secretary Pompeo, welcome.
It's great to be with you, Mike.
I wonder if we could start by getting your help in understanding what a Secretary of State does when you have a crisis like the crisis in Gaza today. How do you begin to frame the issue for the United States, and what would be your major concerns? What would you go to the president with? Just help us understand the usual process.
Sure, that's a fine question. Having said that, most of the work needed to happen before this to prevent this from happening. I know we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but most of the work that a good diplomatic effort does is it achieves deterrence and prevents rockets from actually landing on your friend and ally. So, but when you get that moment, when you have an event like this, the first thing you would do is you would make sure that you had all the information from the field. So we've got folks in every place, not just in Jerusalem and our embassy, and not just working the ground elsewhere, but in Arab states, we've got folks working with allies and partners all across. You would make sure you had a good sight picture of all the things that were going on. And then you would go back to the central theories of the case. You would then present the president the context for the current violence that is taking place against the backdrop of the American imperatives for why we're involved in this place at all. You want to remind everyone that there's a real American national security interests there, what they are, and then a set of options about how one might consider achieving them. I'm sure I would be on the phone with my foreign minister counterparts in our administration. I would likely have been on the phone with the prime minister as well in Israel, working to make sure that we understood how the Israelis were thinking about this. And then we would have the capacity to try and understand from some of our friends, from the Egyptians and others who were talking to other actors in this scenario, to make sure we understood everything we could possibly know about intentions. We know the capabilities. We would come into the crisis knowing these capabilities. We would want to know what it is we believed they thought about the end state they were trying to achieve.
And in your assessment, what are the U.S. national security imperatives in this conflict now?
Well, first of all, anytime there's conflict in the Middle East, this is not good for us in the United States, right? We have enormous international commercial traffic that flows through the Suez Canal and through the Strait of Hormuz. We have a deep interest in Middle East stability, so it doesn't become part of a larger problem set. Second, it's often been the case that for lots of reasons, energy amongst them, that we have found ourselves getting deeper and deeper into these conflicts. We don't want to have to send our young men and women to fight in these places. And then finally, we have great friends and partners in the region. Foremost amongst them is the state of Israel, a great security partner for the United States in lots of places around the world. We have deep diplomatic and economic ties with the state of Israel. It's the lone democracy in the Middle East. We want to preserve and protect that for faithful believers in the United States. Jerusalem is an important place in its own right as well. So there are lots of American interests that are connected to this conflict. And anytime there's terror, anytime there is Middle Eastern terror, there's a risk that this will be brought to the homeland. And so taking down this terror effort, this campaign against the state of Israel, the little Satan, that ultimately could grow into an Iranian campaign against the great Satan, the United States has a deep and consistent interest in doing our best to prevent this kind of thing from happening.
So your comment suggests that you would frame this immediately as a U.S.-Iranian contest, as part of the U.S.-Iranian contest.
Oh, it most certainly is. It most certainly is. These terror proxies are legion, whether it's the Houthis, and I'm not sure, are they still terrorists or not? I think that, right, we had sanctioned them. This, by the way, it wasn't just the Trump administration. They'd been sanctioned by the State Department since 1997, multiple administrations, including the Obama-Biden administration. And somehow now the Houthis are on the good side. They're no longer worthy of U.S. sanctions. I find that odd, and by the way, connected to what we're seeing today. This is part of an appeasement strategy of Iran that has given, if not a green light, has certainly not shown the red light, the deterrence light that we showed to Iran. They're underwriting Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, a real risk, who's watching closely with enormous amounts of precision-guided munitions to the north of Israel, who's watching these rockets fall against Iron Dome and performing their own strategic calculation as well. All of this underwritten by an Iranian regime that just a couple of weeks ago reiterated its genocidal intent with respect to Israel.
When your administration, the Trump administration, was criticized when you recognized Jerusalem as the capital, when you recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, and as part of that criticism, the claim was that there was going to be an explosion in the Middle East. But
Ironic, no?
But the explosion never came. And the explosion comes when the team that said that they had the better method of stabilizing the Middle East is in place. How do you respond to that?
So let me add to this fact pile. Remember, too, I was a member of Congress at the time. Secretary Kerry told the world, if we don't take this deal, if we don't join this deal, this JCPOA, not a comma may be moved, then there will be war. That was a hypothesis. We've now defeated the hypothesis. We need a new hypothesis. We withdrew from the JCPOA, and we didn't have kinetic conflict like you're seeing today inside of Israel. You talked about the embassy move, the sovereignty declaration on the Golan Heights. I would add the statement that the State Department made, which said that some settlements are not inconsistent with international law. All things that the world, including much of the American foreign policy establishment, said, right, this is going to cause war. They have proceeded to begin to undo much of this central understanding, and now we've got this kinetic conflict.
There's one of the things that amazes me about that when I watch it is that there's a tendency in the press to say, you see, we told you so. as if there hasn't been a complete reversal of policy, so that the Trump administration doesn't get the credit for the quiet that existed against all prediction on its watch, but it gets the responsibility for the explosion under the Biden administration.
Yeah, foreign policy jiu-jitsu, right? This is crazy. Look, I've even heard folks say that the Abraham Accords caused terrorists to fire on. I mean, this is a nutty rewrite by the Washington Post and the New York Times and the pro-Palestinian media, who are mouthing the language, interestingly, not only of the terrorist regime in Iran, but if you listen to the language that's coming from the Chinese Communist Party, as they're talking about getting a ceasefire and keeping this under control, they're using this same language about America being as failing to recognize as an important force for good in the Middle East, and the Abraham Accords of having isolated the Iranians in ways they had never been isolated before. And it was that isolation that led to deterrence, not the converse, which this administration, right? Look, they're sitting in Vienna today. They know they're going to get billions of dollars. This is, if you're sitting and making leadership decisions inside the Iranian regime today, you know you're on the cusp of economic victory. You survived to live another day after the enormous pressure that your regime was under during the Trump administration. You're giddy, and you're going to go test this administration. I think you're seeing the testing taking place today.
Now, one would assume, Secretary Blinken was asked the other day if he had any evidence about the Iranian role in the Hamas rocketing of Israel. One would assume he said that he hadn't seen any evidence, but or words to that effect. One would assume that there is enormous intelligence to this effect because Hamas figures and Palestinian Islamic Jihad figures are all over the internet saying thank you, Iran. Right. But he can't say he can't say that he has that evidence, because then it's inevitably going to lead people to say, what are you doing there in Vienna? Why are you giving them all this sanctions relief at this moment?
Right, Mike, I think you've written about this. This is a broader strategic effort by the Biden administration to place Iran as a central figure inside of their vision for what the Middle East, how you talked about realignment, how they'd like to see the Middle East realigned. One of the central failures that you could see from the JCPOA was, right, the theory was, well, this is just a nuclear deal, but it flows into every element. You can't designate the Houthis as terrorists if you want the Iranians to sit down with you in Vienna. You can't oppose Hamas, an ideological, radical terrorist regime sitting in the Gaza Strip, firing missiles against civilians in Israel. You can't be stern with respect to that, because you know you have this other game that's being played, this other element of your policy, and you know that it will upset it. So yes, I think that's precisely what you see. The Iranians know this. They've played this game for an awfully long time. It's why this vision of, hey, if we just get back in the JCPOA, we'll be able to control their missile program and their terror efforts, is such folly. Everyone knows that when we got into the JCPOA, the Obama administration wasn't about to sanction any Iranian terror activity. They weren't about to impose enforcement mechanisms against Iran because they had they had this thing that mattered to this article of faith called the JCPOA that they were so deeply wedded to.
It's really amazing. I mean, if you start ticking off the things that have happened since the Biden administration took power, the Iranians have attacked us in Iraq. They've opened up a front against the Israelis. The Houthis, far from being, as you suggested, far from becoming more moderate when we lifted the terror designation, they redoubled their efforts and their campaign on the ground and sent countless numbers of missiles into Saudi Arabia. Yet I'm shocked by the absence of any sign of reconsidering on the part of the administration. Oh, I would also add that I think the administration expected when they said they wanted to go back to the JCPOA that the Iranians were going to run to come back to the JCPOA. Instead, they're negotiating and making demands, wanting apparently reparations or certainly to keep the extra centrifuges that they put in place and so on. So, but I don't see any signs of a reconsideration, nor in the press do I see them being held to any kind of accountability for these things.
Yeah, I can't account for the press. The press certainly never recognized the pressure, right, that we had the Iranian regime under. You can now see the data. We had them go from $123 billion of foreign exchange reserves down to about a 96% reduction in their capacity to conduct trade around the world. This was a regime that was truly under enormous strain. Their defense budget down by 25%. Their ability to pay Hezbollah, I think the soldiers were getting about half pay at the time. How long are those folks going to stick around? The answer is longer than January 20th. 2020, but I don't think it would have been much longer. I can't account for the press. The administration's never going to walk away from their commitment. They said they were going to get back in the deal. It was an 8-year article of faith for them. It's the same cast of characters, right? Wendy Sherman, Robert O'Malley, Susan Rice. Right? I'm sure Ernie Moniz is hanging around the hoop someplace, right? It's the same cast and crew that fundamentally believed that appeasing Iran was the solution to Middle East stability. I think the world can now see that was folly. I hope that somewhere there will be someone that will take a second clutch at this. I mean, Secretary Blinken was good in his testimony, right? He said longer and stronger. If they demand a longer and stronger agreement that is infinity and including strong things like preventing missiles from flying from Gaza to Tel Aviv, sign me up.
You know, you were in the CIA and in the State Department. And did you have the feeling that the career bureaucrats you were working with shared this view that the administration has that we can somehow find a deal with Iran, that the key to stabilizing the region is to be sweeter to Iran rather than to deter it in traditional military terms? Or is this something that's coming from outside of the traditional national security elite?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Mixed. Very mixed. Certainly the intelligence that was being derived was based on a set of historic understandings about the relationship and had been subsumed into U.S. foreign policy with respect to the Palestinians' role and how that was a central underpinning. Much of the intelligence community would have predicted that when you moved the embassy that you'd have real conflict, whether that was in the streets of Islamabad or Amman or someplace in the world. It, of course, didn't happen. But there were lots of people, even in the CIA, as well as folks at the State Department, who understood that creative thinking was a useful approach and that the other approach had most certainly failed, and who came alongside of us and tried to help deliver on the vision that President Trump had laid out.
Let me take you back to the Abraham Accords, which you mentioned before. Jen Psaki recently said, aside from, that's the White House press secretary, aside from putting forward a peace proposal that was dead on arrival, we don't think that that's you and President Trump, we don't think that they did anything constructive really to bring an end to the longstanding conflict in the Middle East.
Well, you should ask Mohammed bin Zayed, you should ask the people of Bahrain, you should ask the people of Sudan and Morocco and Saudi Arabia. They felt like we did an enormous amount of good for the Middle East. Some of them signed historic agreements, but all of them were stronger and more secure because of the pressure that we put on the Iranian regime and the support that we provided to the State of Israel and to them. When they were confronted by Iran, the United States stood alongside those Gulf states as well. And they too, they came to see that when we proffered a reasonable proposition with the sole ask of the Palestinians, the sole ask was sit down at the table. Don't have to accept what we propose, jot and tittle. Don't have to sign the deal as we drafted it. Just sit at the table. They too came to see that the Palestinians were just no, 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 that this corrupt leadership inside of the West Bank, the terror regime inside of Gaza, had no interest in resolving this conflict with Israel. And they said, we're not going to let that stand in the way of the well-being of the people of our countries. The presidential spokesperson can say what she wants, but I am confident that the people who were impacted by this most understood how much good the Trump administration did for prosperity and peace throughout the Middle East.